Hey, good afternoon and welcome to the people that are just joining this 30-minute webinar, Children and Climate Change Suggestions for Education. My name is Louise Edgington and I'm an educational psychologist in Westminster, Kensington and Chelsea. And I've had a fairly long-standing interest in climate because I actually did a physics undergrad, then I was a science teacher and taught climate science. Did an internship at Bloomberg New Energy Finance, and now it's come around again in my work as an EP, been running a working group in our borough thinking about climate change. And through that, we've developed a whole suite of sort of resources and ideas and thoughts, which I'm excited to share with you today. I will just reference that this time 2 weeks ago, I did a webinar on eco-emotions and eco-anxiety. And I really very much suggest that if you haven't already, you go back and watch that one, because everything I'm going to touch upon today, thinking about how to support children to be resilient and future focused, as it were, we can't really look towards this stuff without acknowledging and holding emotions around this difficult topic. So please do kind of view the two in conjunction with each other. So the plan for today is to first of all sort of set the scene in terms of what the BPS, the DECP, the position is on climate psychology or climate change thinking as a whole, and also have a look at the DFE strategy paper. Also, then I'm going to sort of talk a little bit about getting the facts, I call it, that notion that because climate change is such an all-encompassing thing, there's so much information out there. How do we teach our children to be discerning about what they're thinking about? And then really the main body of the rest of the talk is some tips, and these will apply to parents and teachers that we may be talking to in our work. And I've sort of presented it all as one package. So, you may need to sort of adapt this to the situation in hand, but I'll look at how to talk with children about climate change, a bit more for parents. General tips and thoughts that we've just been sharing about how to prepare children for an uncertain future. And then lastly, we'll look at some activities, actions, books and resources that can be really useful for schools to approach this topic in a sort of psychologically considerate manner. So looking then at the first, move that bar up there. The first point is to just, if you're not aware of it already, to draw your attention to the British Psychological Society, the DECP's position paper written by an EP, Dan O'Hare. Do check it out. It's a great summary of a lot of the research out there and quite fairly outlines some things we need to think about, which is that children will be bearing the brunt of climate change. Psychologists recognize that increasing anxiety is present in children and young people, and that children themselves, as well as the research, is strongly indicating that we need to be able to talk about this topic and to hold children's anxieties and to educate them going forward. So Dan O'Hare is the other EP alongside me that is on this newly formed BPS Climate and Environment Action Coordinating Group. We've yet to have any sort of strong direction, but I'm really keen to hear of any thoughts or ideas that people may have about what the BPS should be doing in this field. And just lastly, to flag up here about university. So today I'm going to be thinking about education in schools, but the status of university climate psychology thus far. There are some modules out there at UCL, Sussex, Surrey, Glasgow, York and TCD, but I mean, something I'd love to see happen is for this to get onto the BPS training standards for our profession. So that's where we're at the moment. There's a lot of good intentions out there, but nothing yet is sort of solidly in place to enshrine this thinking in our university level education anyway. So thinking about schools, the DFE have published last year their Sustainability and Climate Change Strategy for the Education of Children's Services Systems. Now, this is worth a look. I welcome it. I think it's great that this is happening, even though it's late. But going through it, they focus a lot on, quite rightly, climate education and skilling children up for green careers. You know, what are the opportunities as we look to shift in a more sustainable direction? They also think a lot about the school buildings and supply chains, making sure that they are sustainable themselves. And it also talks about the importance of nature and connection to nature, all of which I'm thoroughly in favour of if it happens. But reading through it as a psychologist, the really glaring thing is that there's no mention of well-being or of eco-anxiety or of eco-emotions or of this sort of paralysing fear that can sometimes grip people. And I do strongly think that as psychologists, there's a role for us to, A, be flagging up the emotional impact of all of this, and, you know, be helping schools think about how to handle this. And the other thing, which I'm not going to get into in too much detail today, but it's really clear that when you look through the paper, the government are very anti-protest and explicitly recommend that schools do not allow children to protest on school time. We'll go on to talk about the importance of protest in a second, but this is an ongoing debate and one which I would encourage you to engage in, because you know, the public order bill, that's what it's called, is concerning. So, much like a quick look at the BPS position and the DFE position, before we get into the nitty-gritty of it, it's really important for us as adults supporting children, as EPs, and for teachers and parents to just consider this, the psychology of information, the psychology of fact-finding. There's so much out there with the internet at the moment, and that it's actually very hard to find the truth. And this applies to all subjects and topics, not just climate change. But as you can imagine, it's critically important that we think about how and where we get our information from. So here are some things to bear in mind, and this is, again, using psychology to think about this. As humans, we all have cognitive biases. We do not think rationally. The trouble is that this can affect the type of news that is on the newsstands or on our, you know, the top page of your whatever news website you go to. It can affect what we choose to read. We don't read everything that's in front of us. We'll just cherry pick what looks interesting. And, as you'll be aware, our social media feeds. So just going through each of those in turn a little bit. The news on offer, psychologist Daniel Gilbert, the reference down there at the bottom, he has this theory that news, such as in this Sun headline here, this attention-grabbing headline, because papers and news outlets need eyeballs, they will quite naturally tend to put news out there that is personal, so it affects us. It's happening abruptly, it's quite sudden. Things that are immoral, so, you know, terrorism or well, any number of other scandalous things, and things that are happening now. So what that means is headlines such as this London Bridge terror is, well, obviously highly important. It's probably going to sell more papers than a headline about 400 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. And this affects the sort of diet of information that we've received so far, and part of the reason why it's been easy to keep our heads in the sand. Number two, cognitive biases also affect what we choose to read. There's a whole suite of cognitive biases in Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow. who won a Nobel Prize for it. One of the best is this optimism bias. You know, we might be unconsciously drawn to things that make us feel a bit better, but there's a whole other host of biases in this way. And another bias, number 3, we have a strong confirmation bias. We like to be told, or we like to read what we already know. So in the context of social media with the algorithms, that can lead us to just being fed the same sort of thing over and over again, which can lead us down different rabbit holes and this echo chamber phenomenon, which is dangerous for learning, quite frankly. So we need to be aware of our own cognitive biases, and we need to be encouraging children and ourselves, we need to be modeling this, to be discerning about what we read, to be critical and inquisitive, and not to just take things at face value. So here's a little visual that, you know, a teacher might like to use as a template for a lesson, perhaps on how to spot fake news, how to determine the accuracy of a news source. So when I talk to schools, you know, I do encourage them to think about these things. And sad to say, more and more recently, we need to be even more careful. Just today, deep fakes, I Googled deep fake, and this was apparently a video of Trump being arrested, but it's a fake. We can't, nobody can just trust what we read off the bat. I mean, yes, sure, we have to have some sort of news sources that we go to and hope are reliable, but we do have to develop the skill of being discerning. Okay, so all of that was a sort of precursor. It's setting the scene for where are we at when we're trying to help children navigate this. And this is the starting point, really, some tips, and it's more of an attitude to bring when we're trying to just have these difficult conversations with children, be they our students, the children we're working with as EPs, or our own children. So this list was actually mainly put together by a team I do some consultancy work for called the Climate Psychologists. And they have a lovely book, actually. I'll show you it if I find it later. Turn the Tide, How to, from Anxiety to Action. It's all about managing eco-emotions. So the first 2 tips or things to bear in mind when we're having conversations with children about climate change relates to the previous point about facts. We need to find out what they know. We can't assume what they know because, you know, nowadays children are exposed to information from basically the whole of the internet via their peers sometimes. So we need to not assume they do or don't know something. And we need to separate facts from feelings and facts from fiction. So if they're, you know, if you've attended the previous webinar thinking about, oh, I feel it's hopeless, that would be a good opportunity to sort of tease out, well, it sounds like you're feeling hopeless, but making it clear that that's not the same as the actual situation. Separate facts from feelings. And yeah, be honest when you don't know something and engage in a fact-finding exercise together. So that can be a wonderful opportunity to model Googling something, working out what could be a reliable news source, working out, you know, going through that template actually. So, fact-finding. And this, you know, as EPs, we would naturally do this, I feel, but in handouts to parents, this can be super helpful. Listen with empathy and be sensitive to their state. So if a child says, I'm just really not feeling it, no, don't push it. We need to be attuned to where children are at and meet them there. And another thing to bear in mind is that children who have experienced trauma or adverse childhood experiences will have a reduced window of tolerance for this anxiety-provoking topic. So we need to just be sensitive to where they're at in the moment. Going along with that is this notion that we're responding to where the child is at. So, no child is going to be able to process all of this at once. It's all about bite-sized chunks in age-appropriate bits of information, and we'll look at examples of what that could be in a few slides' time. For every difficult fact, try and present 3 solutions. So focus on empowering action and agency. This is so, so important. What we want to avoid is that message of children are going to save the world. That is actually quite frightening for a young child to have that responsibility put on them. So what we're actually trying to model is, yes, you have agency, but we're all in this together, and I'm here to help and support you. And look at what's already happening. Look at what's possible. And lastly, or this is probably first, make time to talk. So prioritize this as a conversation to have. But as someone with small children myself, often these questions will come at the most inconvenient time. But where you can, do try and roll with that. It is important. Okay, so next we have 2 slides of general tips. General tips really for, it's more of an ethos or a state of mind that as parents and teachers might be helpful to help children be more resilient in the face of uncertainty, in the face of quite significant change. Because things are going to change. That's the only certainty we have at the moment. And the combination of biotech advances and AI, it does make it impossible to predict, and that's a whole other webinar series, I would say. So just some thoughts, and I'll rattle through them because I want to get on to the end bit as well. We being the climate change working group in my borough, that it would be helpful to move away from this notion of a career, particularly those careers that may be replaced by AI or have to shift because of climate a bit more. However, there are lots of opportunities in this necessary shift to a more sustainable economy, and I invite you to check out Bill Gates's TED Talk, The Innovations We Need to Avoid a Climate Disaster. I actually found it quite inspiring. Model the lifestyle behaviors that have to change. So by that, I mean, as a parent, I'm not like taking my kids on far-flung lavish holidays every year and driving around everywhere, because I know that is what we'll have to scale back on. So we are already just trying to focus more on, living with what we need rather than what we want, and excess consumerism. Number 3, respect and enjoy nature. And I appreciate this is not, this is harder for some people living in cities, but it is still possible. So care for nature and appreciation of it is necessary if we want to feel motivated to protect it. We also believe, number 4, that it's important to value the human skills of creativity, critical thinking, and caring for others. We are only going to move through this super challenge with everyone, or most people, pulling in the same direction and moving away from the focus on the self. COVID illustrated that quite neatly. As adults, we need to model being agile and adaptable and staying ahead of developments. So, things like ChatGPT, when it comes out, GPT, we need to be making an effort to stay relevant and stay engaged. Otherwise, children would just think of us as dinosaurs. And it's a similar notion, really. Number 6, we need to stay humble. Mum knows best, but this notion that teachers always right is not going to be helpful in a fast-paced, unstable situation. And number 7, again, talking to this sort of climate of uncertainty, as adults, the more comfortable we can be with that, the more natural it will feel to children. If they're used to not quite knowing and things always changing, and the adults around them aren't getting scared by it, that's really, really going to help. The link there to some suggested ways of building your tolerance for uncertainty, and talked about that in the eco-emotions video too. Okay, so the last few slides are all about more sort of practical suggestions for schools, but it's relevant for parents as well. So this is what we tend to be sharing with schools. And I've broken it down, you'll see here, by preschool and reception, primary age, and on the next slide, secondary age pupils. So for your preschoolers and reception age children, it's all about making it, concrete and relevant to their everyday life. So just discussions around, why we try not to use the car, or why we might turn the tap off when you're brushing your teeth. They can get that quite well, we feel. Obviously, getting out into nature. Personification and stories of animals. So, stories about how animals are affected, done sensitively, helps children just begin to sort of understand the emotions behind it without the overwhelming sense of having to apply it to themselves necessarily. Todd Parr's Earth book is really cute for, 3-year-olds, I would say. That's a great starting point. Somebody Swallowed Stanley. That's a lovely example of a sort of personification, and it's like a beautiful story. It is about plastics, and I would just say, although the issue of plastics is highly, highly important, it can be something of a red herring in the climate field. It doesn't contribute to sort of global warming quite to the same extent as people assume. So if you're not aware of that distinction, maybe do just give that a bit of a Google and make sure you're clear. Okay. So for the primary age children, carrying on with the focus on daily activities and stories, but also it can be really lovely to start learning about young activists. This book, Greta and the Giants, is beautiful. It talks about the giants, being the sort of governments and corporations, how they gradually shrink as her sort of movement grows. It's very beautifully done, but obviously there are so many more activists around the globe than Greta. So we encourage teachers to look at the spread and look at young people that represent their class population. Incidental references and normalizing. Now that's what we're increasingly finding, is if a book or even a talk like today's talk has climate in the title, people might tend to avoid it because of the fear. So what we're increasingly finding with climate communication and just helping people think about these things is just to slip in messages along the way. So this book, Izzy Gizmo, is just a regular book about a girl that enters an invention competition, and she in the end wins the competition when she invents a tool fixer that is powered by the sun and the wind. So it's like gently slipping in messages that renewable energy is good, and repairing rather than buying new is good, but without shoving it down your throat or without causing any alarm whatsoever. Making reference to stories and case studies of social change is also super powerful. There are so many examples, but from an environmental perspective, I think the ozone layer, global efforts to reduce CFCs and the impact that has had is very inspiring. And at primary age, you can begin, and you'll see it in a lot of schools already, they do little projects focused on their own school environment. So it could be a drive to recycle more. It could be sort of walk to school week. So many different things that children can get involved with, but they do need a bit of support in doing this, obviously. Eco Schools is a national accreditation, sorry, it's global accreditation, that can help schools set up these kind of projects and to be monitoring their practices as well. And debate. Now, I'll say more about that actually on the next slide. So for secondary age children, I'll just jump down to the debate point actually. Here, and this starts in primary, but by the age of secondary school, children really should be encouraged to be looking at facts and discerning what they think, and then using that to form opinions and to express opinions and to hear other people's opinions and engage in a dialogue. It's not about spoon feeding and shoving things down children's throats anymore. We want our citizens to be informed and to be able to think critically. So we often suggest, having little debate cards can be a lovely thing to do. The project learning at secondary age, here you can really go beyond the school environment, and you could even get online and start some sort of campaign to raise awareness on social media about things like greenwashing practices. So when big brands and corporations use the popular interest in sustainability just to sell more product. Again, learning about young activists around the world, but making it representative, and you can really flesh it out more, particularly in a geographical context, actually. Decision-making role plays, so you could make this up yourself, like there's a activity minister for the future, but also the Financial Times have produced this sort of simulation climate game where you have to make decisions based on things like carbon credits, cost and ease. Protest, yeah. So the Association of Clinical Psychologists did release a statement a while back outlining the importance of protest for social connectedness, for a sense of self-efficacy, and that it actually works. So from a psychological perspective, certainly my group of psychologists, we believe that protest is good and important, but you should be aware that the DFE seem to have an other position, and we can't really be advising schools one way or the other when they're in that sticky situation. But, certainly protest outside of school hours, fantastic. Okay, so climate justice issues. Now, I've given this its own slide, just really just to explain the term if you haven't already heard it. And at secondary age, this is something that we have found children really engage in. So with the climate psychologists, we're doing this Mind and Planet educational program, and in the sort of piloting that's been done on it, young people really get engaged. They absolutely understand this issue, that the most affected people in areas of the globe, the most affected by climate change, historically are the ones who have been least responsible for global emissions. It is entirely unjust. And this needs to be fully understood and taught. And actually, it can be helpful to just hold that in mind when thinking about the global picture of climate anxiety. And I'll draw your attention to Hickman's, I think she, or their team interviewed 10,000 young people around the globe. And they asked them a variety of sort of statements, but the highest was the Philippines. 92% believe the future is frightening. Obviously, they're very strongly affected and not particularly responsible for many of the emissions. And the lowest affected, interestingly, was Finland. And there may be another of, other factors at play there. And I can't claim to know enough about Finland to speculate on that right now. But just want to draw your attention here to the UK statistic. 72% of 16 to 25-year-olds interviewed in the UK agreed with the statement, "The future is frightening." I think that's quite sobering. Even though we don't suffer from the worst direct impacts, many of our children that we support will have relatives in other countries. Many will be affected by what they see on the news. And yes, there will be secondary and direct impacts that is underlying this. Okay. So just to finish off a bit quickly, I'd like to just also draw your attention to some of the UNESCO resources that are really easy for schools to just pick up and run with. So they've produced a Getting Climate Ready, a guide for schools on climate action. It outlines just things for schools to be thinking about, and this very much is whole school approach to being a sustainable school. They refer to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which I'm seeing more and more, actually. I'm seeing it in businesses, but also a lot of independent schools are doing projects around these goals. And helpfully, UNESCO also have a bunch of resources and lesson plans, one for each different sustainable development goal. So there's so much out there, and I invite teachers to explore for themselves, but there's definitely not a need to sort of reinvent the wheel. This is out there. It's just a case of having the willingness to run with it, I would say. Okay, so I'd like to maybe just end on this slide. Real change in the world will only come from a change of heart. What I propose, this is the Dalai Lama, is a compassionate revolution, a call for radical reorientation away from our habitual preoccupation with self. It is a call to turn towards the wider community of beings with whom we are connected, and for conduct which recognizes others' interests alongside our own. So, probably more than anything else I've been saying in the slides today, I feel it is this attitude of our sort of growth capitalism mindset focusing on the me, on the I. Climate is a consequence of that. And really, if we are going to turn the tide and build a more sustainable future that works for everybody, we do need to shift our mindset to think more about the collective we. And it is possible. We just need more people on board. Okay. I will stop sharing. Thank you for your attendance today. And I will look to the chat in case there are any questions. Thank you very much for sharing the links, everybody. That is very helpful. Okay, well, without any, thank you. Without any burning questions, I guess I will leave it there. Thank you.